YouTube, Reddit, Twitch, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and now Spotify. Over the past 6 months, I've made 6 videos now on various prominent banned users on social media platforms, and this one might be the most interesting. For you see, compared to the other platforms that I mentioned just a moment ago, Spotify doesn't exactly ban controversial or criminal artists as much as it distances itself from them. If you go and look up any controversial artist on Spotify, especially if they're popular enough, their music will likely still be up there, whether their crimes are just mere allegations or whether they literally confess to them in song form. But sometimes what they will do, if the artist has done something controversial enough or has faced legal repercussion for their actions, is try to disassociate themselves from them the best they can by removing these musicians from their official playlists. But there can be some small caveats to this where the artists are terminated for good. So in this video, I want to talk about some of the artists that were, at least for a time, or even might be right now, banned by Spotify. I'll tell you who they were, why they were, and if they or their music has been allowed back into the fold ever since. Things are about to get juicy, so let's get into it. Okay, first things first, let's tackle the elephant in the room, R. Kelly. We just have to talk about him. I want to say that all of you know who he is, but just in case for the 6 or 7 people at the back of the room that don't know, he was an extremely famous and successful singer. He sold 75 million records, won 3 Grammys, and was dubbed the king of R&B, despite apparently billing himself as the Pied Piper of R&B, which in fairness, is a pretty bang-on comparison if you know the reference. He definitely wasn't wrong about that. But even ever since the 90s, this dude has always been known to be a predator. In 2002, he was indicted on CP charges, though he walked away free 6 years later. He was later featured on the Boondocks in 2005 when they ripped into the guy, and he was the focal point of the 2019 documentary Surviving R. Kelly, which led his record label to terminate his contract. And to top it all off, in June 2022, he was given 30 years in prison for sexual abuse. His reputation is in absolute tatters, and to many, these allegations have overshadowed his music career, with a good portion of the public, especially those born after the 90s, knowing him more for the charges against him than his work. But what you might be surprised to hear about is that Spotify removed him from all of their official playlists back in 2018, before the release of Surviving R. Kelly. And obviously I don't need to explain why he was shadow banned, I just listed all of his crimes. But of course there was a catalyst, a trigger, and that was the rise of the Me Too as well as the Mute R. Kelly movements. The latter of which was founded by Kenneth Barnes and Orenike Odeleye in July 2017. The campaign, it has to be said, should be considered successful in its aims, as R. Kelly's music would soon fade from our radios. And since then, his music has remained off Spotify's official playlists. Once again though, let me reiterate that most people I'm going to be speaking about today, R. Kelly included, are still in fact on Spotify, but they are no longer pushed by Spotify themselves. Most of these artists are also put back onto Spotify's official playlists after the heat cools down, but R. Kelly is not one of these people. He's remained off their playlists from the time they introduced their hate content and hateful conduct policy up until now. Now, this is the first time that I mentioned the hate content and hateful conduct policy, but I actually have to step in here and pause the video. Because when I recorded this, I actually forgot to mention what this hate content and hateful conduct policy was, and it's quite an important thing to mention for these first 3 stories especially. You guys probably know by now that almost every modern social media platform have policies put in place that allow them to ban users who don't follow them. These policies usually fall under the categories of hate speech, inciting violence, harassment, extremism, and promoting self-harm or dangerous lifestyles, just to name a few of the most common. And as I'll explain later, Spotify tried to bring in their own conduct policy in May 2018, but it was relatively short-lived. The policy was focused on 2 points. The first being that creators embroiled in serious controversy were disassociated with the Spotify brand. The second was that content that was considered to include hate speech would be removed. Though according to Spotify, this second point has carried on since the policy was repealed, as we'll discuss later on in the video. But it was because this policy was so quickly gone back on that Spotify doesn't openly ban artists. I think that's all I wanted to say, so with that said, let's rewind to where we were and carry on. He's remained off their playlists from the time they introduced their hate content and hateful conduct policy up until now. But the same can't be said for XxXTentacion, however. As he was banned at the exact same time as R. Kelly, right as the hate content and hateful conduct policy was introduced in May 2018. Now, if you're a fan of X, you might know that he was shot and killed on the 18th of June 2018, only a month after his music was algorithmically suppressed by Spotify. However, the accusations levied against him prior to his death were very serious. He was awaiting trial for a plethora of charges against him, including aggravated battery of a pregnant victim, domestic battery, false imprisonment, and witness tampering. The events leading to these charges can be dated back to 2016, when he was charged by the Miami-Dade County State Attorney's Office. It was alleged that when he was 18, he had battered his girlfriend because he believed that she had cheated on him. The rapper would plead not guilty and maintained his innocence for the rest of his life. But in October 2018, months after his death, Pitchfork released some secretly recorded audio in which X supposedly admitted to what he did. As I said, this recording was released after the rapper's death, and so Pitchfork received backlash for this. But nonetheless, these accusations are thought to be the reason that he was removed from Spotify's official playlists while he was still alive. What might be a bit of a shock though, is that though Spotify launched their hateful conduct policy in early May 2018, by literally June 1st, less than a month after it was launched, it was scrapped because Spotify thought that the language that it used in its announcement was too vague and too open to interpretation. So before he passed, X's music was in fact back on Spotify's official playlist. But even this caused a bit of controversy, because some people thought that they had added him back on right after his death, trying to capitalise on the situation, even if this wasn't the case. He had already been back on Spotify's official playlists for a few weeks prior to his passing. But while X's music was certainly, at least for a time, censored by Spotify, the case of Tay K might have been slightly different, because X's and R. Kelly's shadow bannings were more spoken about, but Tay K's, on the other hand, was much more quiet. In fact, the main reason why news articles picked up on it was because Tay K tweeted out about it. If he didn't, the entire situation may have happened in silence. Now, I'm not too sure what kind of music my audience listens to. If you want to tell me, please do let me know in the comments. I would love to read what you guys have to say. So just in case you guys don't know him, Tay K is a now 22-year-old Texas-based rapper. Back in May 2018, when the hateful conduct policy changes were temporarily announced, he was 18, but was already in trouble with the law. At the time, he was awaiting trial for murder and robbery charges allegedly related to a 2016 incident. Now, sources vary on specific details, but the most common story that I've heard is that Tay K, real name Tamar McIntyre, conspired with then 19-year-old Megan Holt and 20-year-old Ariana Barrett to rob a 19-year-old named Zachary Bellowait. The plan was that the girls were going to seduce the young man and then go back to his place, where they would leave the door unlocked, letting people into the house to rob it. However, when this came to happen, Bellowait was in the house at the time with his friend Ethan Walker. Tay K, the apparent orchestrator, had recruited gunmen Lotharian Merritt and Sean Robinson, as well as others, to enact this drug and money theft. But things went horribly wrong after these hired men shot both Zachary and Ethan. Zachary was allegedly hit in the head with brass knuckles and shot in the shoulder, but would survive. Ethan, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky and was shot whilst his hands were in the air, his girlfriend testified. This, unfortunately, would prove fatal for Ethan. Tay K was only 16 at the time of this shooting, but once the news broke, disturbingly, it massively helped his rap career. He was placed under house arrest, but in March 2017, he removed his ankle monitor and tweeted, "F this house arrest shit, they gonna have to catch me." He fled from Texas to New Jersey, but in June 2017 was recaptured and accused of beating and robbing a 65-year-old man and murdering a 23-year-old while on the run. He also made a music video for his song The Race in this time, and this leads us to 2018, when he was removed from Spotify's public playlists for a short time. But after the death of the hateful conduct policy a few weeks later, he's since been accepted back into the fold. But it probably doesn't matter too much anyway, because in July 2019, he was found guilty of murder for his part in the 2016 robbery. He was sentenced to 55 years in prison and is still awaiting trial for the charge against the 23-year-old victim he's said to have murdered whilst out on the run. So it's unlikely that the rapper will ever see the outside world again. But someone who almost never saw his music back on Spotify was Mr. Julion Alvarez, whose entire back catalogue was fully banned from the platform for 5 years. Julion Alvarez, the now 39-year-old from Mexico, was given a ban from Spotify back in 2017 after what's been described as a shocking drug-related scandal. This distressing news story broke after it was discovered that he had links to Mexican drug kingpin Raul Flores Hernandez. However, the harsh penalty of being banned from the platform for 5 years might have not been down to Spotify's discretion. Alvarez denied all of the allegations, but nonetheless, the Office of Foreign Assets Control stepped in to take him off of the platform. Alvarez claims that the reason that he's linked to the kingpin was that back in 2013, he associated himself with a construction company. A construction company that he didn't realize at the time had links with Hernandez. Since these allegations came out, Julion Alvarez has not toured in the USA, but he is back on Spotify now. Not only that, but he's featured in a ton of Spotify created playlists, so he's back in the good books, perhaps to stay now after his 5-year absence. And while we're talking about 2017, just over 5 years ago as of writing this video, the band Power Bottom were temporarily not only just banned from Spotify, but also all other big music streaming services. We're talking the likes of Apple Music, Tidal, Google Play, and Amazon. But the reason for this, however, wasn't down to these services themselves. Instead, it actually comes from their label Polyvinyl, who represent such well-named bands as Japandroids, Stagnant Pools, and Someone Still Loves You Boris Yeltsin. But while I joke, what Ben Hopkins, one member of the duo that made up Power Bottom, was alleged to have done is no laughing matter. The pair that made up the Brooklyn-based punk band both identified as non-binary and created music that celebrated their identities. They had just dropped their second album, titled Pageant, days before, when on Facebook, inside a private group called DIY Chicago, came a message posted by Kitty Cadero Collin, who came out and accused Hopkins of sexual abuse. Kitty claims that they didn't understand when someone said no to their advances, or at the very least, they wouldn't care. She told people inside this Facebook group to boycott the band because of this. And this came as a huge shock to the fan base, because often during live shows, Hopkins would grab the mic and promote being respectful to people in romance and relationships, pushing ideals that he himself is alleged to have violated. Hopkins was also alleged to be anti-Semitic, but the abuse story was just so large that it overshadowed that second allegation. Touring partners, as well as associated acts, distanced themselves from Power Bottom. And soon they were dropped by their label, who refused to carry on selling their records or merchandise, also later taking them off Spotify. Their back catalogue was returned shortly after, but their album Pageant had to follow later as it was the subject of legal issues. Hopkins has continually denied these allegations, but their reputation has been utterly destroyed by them nonetheless. So far in this video, essentially every artist I've spoken about has been relatively well known. And so for this next story, I want to delve into the unknown and talk about a more niche band. This is the story of Smokey and the Mirror, who in 2015 claimed they were removed off Spotify for having too loyal of a fan base. The story goes that they released an album back in 2015 called Thin Black Line. They then rallied their fans to go listen to it, which they would have done, but Spotify claims that perhaps the album wasn't as popular as it might have appeared, because they thought that Smokey and the Mirror were using bots to boost their numbers. As this is prohibited, Spotify decided to ban them, and the Arkansas-based husband-wife duo took to the internet to try and tell their side of the story. Today, we were notified by our distributor, CD Baby, that Spotify removed our album because they analysed the listening data on our album and felt it was excessive, and that the listening was coming from a small group of listeners, and all the listeners were predominantly listening to our album more than other content on Spotify. They appealed to Spotify, who was having none of it. A Spotify community moderator made the point that with only 30 followers on their page at the time, there was no way they could get 79,000 streams for the album, so something didn't add up. For a short time, it's to my understanding that they were banned from Spotify, but have since been let back on. The source of this controversy, however, their 2015 album Thin Black Line, has never returned. Smokey and the Mirror, if the allegations are true, tried to play Spotify and lost. But back in 2014, there was a band called Vulfpeck who, it could be argued, tried to play Spotify and won. This is their story. The tale goes that they came up with a bit of an ingenious scheme to make some money. I'm not 100% sure if this has changed in the 8 years since, it might well have done, but back in 2014, a single stream on Spotify would make you $0.007, right? And Vulfpeck needed some money to try and help fund their upcoming tour, so they devised a plan. For a song on Spotify to make that $0.007, it needs to be streamed for at least 30 seconds. So Vulfpeck decided to drop an album called Sleepify, which is compiled of a bunch of songs each 30 seconds in length, and then they went to social media to ask their fans to listen to this album whilst they're going to sleep. Of course, it's silent, so it's not going to keep them up all night. Each song is 30 seconds long, so it's making them the money, and you know, in the end, it's a win-win. Their fans complied and they flocked to Sleepify in their droves, and apparently the band made $20,000 just by people listening to a silent 30-second track. And on top of this, they promised to tour the locations that streamed it the most for completely free, which they would later do. So if you lived in an area that streamed it the most, well, you could go to one of their gigs free of charge. Of course, this did violate Spotify's terms of service, and so while the platform would call it clever and cheeky, Sleepify was eventually taken down, never to return. But it was a phenomenal idea in my opinion nonetheless. But while Sleepify is perhaps the least controversial story I have today, this next one is going to ruffle some feathers. Let's talk about Morgan Wallen, who in 2021 had a video of him emerge in which he said the N-word. This story goes without saying that it caused his music to be temporarily pulled from radios as well as music streaming services' official playlists. It wasn't said in a way that was insulting to the person it was spoken to, it was said after a night out. Wallen seemed very drunk and was walking into his house. On top of this, the person who he said this slur in reference to was white. The clip was sent into TMZ and was claimed to be some sort of doorbell camera, but on reviewing the clip you can tell that it wasn't, it was clearly someone manually recording. But this leads me to one of two conclusions. The more optimistic of these was that this nosy neighbour might have just wanted a payout from TMZ and was insistent on catching Wallen out. The more pessimistic on the flip side was that this kind of thing was common from Wallen and it happened a lot, and the neighbour had had enough and wanted to put an end to it. Wallen would go to rehab in response to this and would publicly apologise, telling his fans not to defend his actions. But whatever the case, and this is going to sound terrible, it might not have been such a bad thing for his career. Okay, no, let me explain before you attack me, because although his music was pulled from playlists and the radio, it was reported by NBC that in response to this news story breaking, Wallen saw a 327% increase in song sales and a massive 1,220% increase in digital album sales. Now, Wallen admitted that his latest album was selling quite well prior to this controversy, but obviously in response to this giant uptake in sales, well, a conversation had to be had about the type of people that were listening to his music. Now, this story the entire way through has been very dicey, so let me remind you, this is not my conversation, I am a mere messenger of this. But the idea is that the people that should be most offended by a white guy saying the N-word are black people, right? But Morgan Wallen creates country music, which at least traditionally wouldn't be classified as black music, even though you as well as I both know that music just isn't defined by race. But the argument is that it's not like his audience would have been massively impacted by this because there wouldn't have been a very large number of black people listening to him in the first place. But there might have been a large number of people listening to him that don't really care so much about the slur being used. And if you don't believe me, when asked if there was a race problem in country music, Wallen replied, "It would appear that way." But just like most people we've spoken about today, Wallen's music wouldn't be off the radios and official playlists for long, and after a while, the storm blew over, and Wallen was allowed back into the fold. It went without saying that Wallen was going to face repercussions for his actions, but in the case of our next band, well, they face repercussions, perhaps, just because of their name. This is the story of Infant Annihilator. Now, straight up, I can tell you that the topic of their name is also shared by a lot of the titles of their music, many of which I don't even think I can show you because they either have strong swear words in them or describe horribly graphic scenes, many of which, again, refer to fetuses and babies. Now, they have almost 150,000 monthly listeners, so they're by no means a small band or anything, but I don't think anyone would really be missing them. I mean, I'll be honest, their music is perhaps the worst I've ever heard. I mean, I've heard cats fighting that sounds better than what I listen to. If you were looking for an alternative to them, maybe chuck a dozen screws in a blender and turn it on, because that is a sound comparable to what I heard. But music aside, I have to be fair to them and say that there are some other bands with pretty offensive names that were never given the boot, so you've got to be consistent, right? They might have been terminated because there were too many complaints against them or something, but I guess it wouldn't really matter too much because they were back up on Spotify soon after, and if anything, this termination might have helped them in the long run because it was the most news coverage they had ever had. But by the time in a video that you get to a band called Infant Annihilator, you know you've gone too far, you've gone too deep down the rabbit hole, so with that, we're going to have to end the video. I kindly ask you to follow me on all of my socials and give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would truly, truly appreciate it. So that's it then, we are done here. Thank you for watching.